Now coming to speech. Speech, we can say it's like, if we look at the difference between the human being and the other animals, the most important difference is the facility that human being can communicate with one another, right? So we can communicate with one another with the help of the language and the speech. So speech may be defined, it's not like the exclusive definition, it may be defined as the means of communication. We can communicate with each other, and that separates us from the other lower animals. So the means of communication between two individuals or a group of individuals is called as speech. And this means of communication, it has got two parts, sensory part and the motor part. Now the sensory part of this communication is auditory and the visual, auditory communication part and the visual part. And similarly, in the motor part of the communication, the talk and writing, either we will express our thoughts or we will communicate by writing down the things or by speaking it in the form of speech. So talking or writing. So that these sensory and motor parts of the communications are there. Now in the steps of the communication, first of all there should be a collection of the sensory input, the auditory and visual. Then it should be, first of all it should get integrated and comprehended, integration of the hearing and articulation mechanism, and comprehend it and then execute it via the motor area. And the motor execution area in the case of the language and speech is Broca's area that we have discussed in the part of the frontal cortex. If you want to go back and hear that session, that is present at the channel with the frontal cortex under the heading of the frontal lobe or the frontal cortex. So all these are the parts of the, or we can say the steps of communication. The sensory aspect is the language input, right? The language input, sensory aspect, it involves hearing by the hearing with the help of the ear and seeing the things with the help of eyes, right? And the motor aspect, we can say it, the motor aspect is language output. So the sensory aspect is language input and the motor aspect is the language output. So that language output is the motor aspect involving the vocalization or the articulation, right? Vocalization or the articulation. So these are diagrams, these are the two diagrams, one upper one, this is for speaking a hard word, like I say repeat after me, aphasia, then you will say that word aphasia. That connection has been shown in this diagram. The lower one, this is speaking a written word, like I have written down aphasia and then I ask you to say it. So there are two things, so one by one. First, speaking a hard word, say I speak one word, say class, you have to repeat after me, you will say class. So how this connection happens, I said the word, that is gathered with your external ear, ultimately via those auditory pathway it reaches to the primary auditory area over here, right? From the primary auditory area it goes to the vernix area for the interpretation of the meaning of the word. I said class, so you have to speak that word class. First you will listen, you will hear the word, that function is done by the primary auditory cortex. It will go to the vernix area, the pathway. From the vernix area it will go to the Broca's area. Now this part from the vernix area to the Broca's area, this connecting part, this is called as arcuate fasciculus. Arcuate fasciculus. Actually this fasciculus, this is connecting fiber, and the connecting fibers, they are the white matter of the cerebrum, right? Like whatever we are discussing since last previous 4 or 5 sessions, all these are about the cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex is the gray area, right, the gray matter. And so if we say what is the difference between this gray matter and white matter, just I am drifting away from the topic, but bear with me for 2 to 3 minutes. White matter, right? If we look at the structure of a neuron, this is the cell body, okay, cell body, and this is the nerve fiber. Now the area of the cerebral, or we can say the cerebral hemisphere, where these cell bodies are lying, this is the gray matter. The cell body are located, it forms the gray matter, and these nerve fibers, these tracks, they form the white matter. So if we do the cut section of the cerebral hemisphere, say this is the, actually this is coronal section, we are looking the left and the right cerebral hemisphere, okay. I guess I have got this hemi-neglect syndrome, right? So in this one, this part, this much, 2 to 4 millimeter superficial, this is the gray matter, okay, gray matter. Similarly over here, and these gray matters, these different, say this is the frontal part and this one is the occipital, frontal and occipital, so they cannot function separately, individual. We have seen till now, like there should be association, they will coordinate with each other. So how they will coordinate with each other? This coordination happens with the help of these nerve fibers or tracks, that is called as the white matter. So major chunk of the cerebral hemisphere, it is made up of the white matter. Now there are the gray areas in between too, like the basal ganglia is a gray matter, right? So these, broadly we can divide the white matter into 3 parts. Actually this is a topic of anatomy. People will teach you in detail, that's why I am avoiding this topic. I am just giving you a brief overview. White matter, it can be studied under 3 headings. One is association area, association fibers. Second is commissure fibers, and the third one is projection fibers, right, projection fibers. Now what is the association? Association fibers, they connect the areas of the same cerebral hemisphere. Like say this area has to get connected with this area, then these connecting fibers, they are called as the association. So association can be short association or it can be long association. Long association means if this area is getting connected with this one, the long fiber. Now the arcuate fasciculus we are discussing till now. We just previous slide we were talking about the arcuate fasciculus that connects the Broca's area with the Wernicke's area. That is an example of long association fiber, right? Now the second one is commissural. Commissural means when one cerebral hemisphere communicates with the other cerebral hemisphere. It may be the corresponding area, or it may be, say, this area might correspond connect with this one. So these are the commissural fibers, and first and foremost the major main important example of the commissural fiber is corpus callosum. There is anterior commissural, there is posterior commissural, and then there is corpus callosum. So corpus callosum is the perfect example of commissural. Now remaining the third one, the projection. So these cerebral cortex, they not only communicate with each other or the other cerebral hemisphere, they also go to the other part of the central nervous system, and those tracks, they are called as the projection fibers, like the descending pathway and ascending pathway we have discussed in the sensory and motor part, like the corticospinal, corticobulbar tracks. All these tracks, they fall under the projection fiber, okay, projection fibers. So now coming back to that part, what was that? We were in the middle of this one, yes, of this word. So this is the arcuate fasciculus, arcuate fasciculus. So the Wernicke's area communicate with the Broca's area with the help of the arcuate fasciculus. Now the Broca's area will say, I have seen, our example was to utter the word after me, that is a class. So you heard that word, that goes to the primary auditory cortex area. From the primary auditory cortex area, the connection goes to the vernix area and it is interpreted in the vernix area. From the vernix area, it goes to the Broca's area. So Broca's area decides the pattern of saying the words, or if I say a particular complete sentence, then pattern, in which sequence those words are to be spoken, and it will send the signal to the concerned motor area for the vocal cord. Like if you verbalize or vocalize a word or articulate a word, the muscles of the lip, tongue, larynx, vocal cord, all these are involved. So this signal will go to all those concerned areas, not only to the left side as well, it will also go to the opposite side too, right? So this will complete the cycle of speaking a heard word. Now if I write down that word, class, then you have to speak that word. Then what is the pathway? Instead of going to the primary auditory cortex, it will go to the primary visual area. You have seen that word with the help of your eyeball. Via the optic tract and optic radiation, it reaches to the visual part of, or visual cortex. From the visual cortex, via the angular gyrus, it will reach to the vernix area. This is the angular gyrus, red one, and this is the vernix area. From the vernix area, the pathway will be the same. It will go to the Broca's area via arcuate fasciculus, right? And from the Broca's area, it will go to the motor part of both sides for the muscles of lip, tongue, pharynx, larynx, vocal cord, all those concerned areas. So that's how we speak, or we speak a particular written word or the heard word. Okay, so we can see that if there happens to be any lesion to the or we can say the destruction of the portion of the auditory area, say this auditory was the yellow one, if there happens to be any lesion in the auditory association area or the auditory primary auditory area, then that person will be suffering from aphasia, right? Won't be able to understand and say the word. See, that aphasia is receptive aphasia, right? Receptive, because the issue is that this pathway, whether for the hearing word, say if we go back to this one, this pathway, the firstmost part of this chain is getting affected, and the first part of this chain is for the reception. So that will be called as receptive aphasia. Now what kind of receptive aphasia? It will be auditory receptive aphasia. Auditory receptive aphasia, right? And if there is any lesion in the visual or visual association area, then that will also be a receptive aphasia. But what kind of receptive aphasia? Visual receptive aphasia. So there are two types of the receptive aphasia, visual and auditory. Now the visual receptive aphasia is also known as word blindness. Word blindness. And this auditory receptive aphasia is known as word deafness. That is the common word we can use, say layman's language, we can say the word deafness. But instead of this visual or the auditory association area, the vernix area get affected, then that's called as vernix aphasia, or the receptive, just receptive, not the auditory receptive or the visual receptive, the receptive aphasia, right? And if there happens to be any issue with Broca's area, lesion of the Broca's area, that is called as motor aphasia. Motor aphasia, because that Broca's area in the chain, in this pathway, falls under the motor part, motor aphasia, right? And if there is any issue with this arcuate fasciculus, it is connecting the vernix area to the Broca's area, then if there happens to be any lesion over here, that will be called as conduction aphasia. Means the conduction of that's information, the sensory information that has been interpreted and is supposed to get conveyed to the Broca's area, that pathway is getting affected. So this is called as conduction aphasia. Conduction aphasia. And if the lesion, say the lesion is affecting the vernix area, that is called as a sensory aphasia. But if this lesion happens to be very large, like I said many a times, the most common cause of the lesion affecting all these areas of the cerebral cortex is the cerebrovascular accident. Means there may be compromise in the blood supply of a particular area. It may be due to the thrombus formation or the embolus. So instead of only affecting this much part, if major part of this area is getting affected, or we can say along with the vernix area, backward it goes up to the angular gyrus is also involved, right? Or inferiorly it goes to the lower part of the temporal gyrus, lower areas of the temporal gyrus, or superiorly it goes to up to the sylvian fissure. Okay, sylvian fissure. Then that person won't only have the receptive aphasia, it is almost entirely affecting the parieto-occipito-temporal association area, right? And as I said at the starting of this lecture, the parieto-occipito-temporal association area, we can say this is the seat of the intelligence. So that person will be totally demented for the language understanding, either in the form of the auditory or the visual and communication. And that kind of the aphasia is called as global aphasia. Global means entire, all these things, all these parts are involved. So that is called as global aphasia.